1.95583. For 29 years, that was just an exchange rate. The number of Bulgarian lev it took to buy one Deutsche Mark, later €1, locked in place since 1997 to end a currency crisis. On January 1st, 2026, that number stopped being an exchange rate and became a price of entry. Bulgaria adopted the euro. The lev didn't float away. It was simply retired, converted at the exact peg that had anchored it for 3 decades. Everything in Sofia, from a loaf of bread to a 2-bedroom lease, now carries a euro sign it didn't have 12 months ago. The question this episode asks isn't whether Sofia is cheap. It's whether the cheapest capital in the European Union is still cheap once you take away the currency that made it feel that way. Every city in this series gets measured through 2 different economies operating in the same physical space. In Sofia, that split is sharper than most because it's not just local salary versus foreign remote income. It's also pre-euro price memory versus post-euro price reality. One side of this story is the Bulgarian resident, paid in what were levs and are now euros, watching a rounding conversion turn into what many call inflation. The other side is the foreign remote worker or new resident, arriving under a set of rules that quite literally did not exist a year ago. Both are shopping in the same market. Neither is playing by the same numbers. Start with what a single person actually needs to get by. Multiple cost of living trackers converge on a range rather than one figure. Numbeo-style community data puts non-rent monthly spending for one person at roughly €600 to €1,050, depending on lifestyle, while a 2026 salary-needed calculator anchored to Bulgarian tax and rent data lands on €1,602 a month gross as the floor for a lean, no-frills budget, rising to €1,948 for something a resident would call comfortable. These aren't competing claims about the same thing. The lower range measures raw expenses. The higher range works backward from take-home pay after Bulgaria's roughly 22% effective tax and social security bite. Both are legitimate. They're just answering different questions. Now stack the income side, because Sofia's salary numbers climb steeply once you know where to look. Bulgaria's national minimum wage sits at €1,213 lev a month for 2026, about €620. The national average net salary, blended across the whole country, was roughly €1,070 as of mid-2025 data from the National Statistical Institute. Move to Sofia specifically, and the number jumps again. NSI regional data puts the average Sofia salary at €1,783 to €1,914, depending on the quarter cited, well above the national blend, because the capital pulls in IT, finance, and multinational back-office jobs that don't exist at those wages anywhere else in the country. For numbers, for different pictures of Bulgaria, €620, €1,070, €1,783, €1,914. Somewhere in that climb is the actual gap between rural Bulgaria and its capital. One side, a Sofia resident earning the city's average salary, paid in euros that used to be levs, watching rent absorb whatever share of that paycheck the market decides. The other side, a remote worker earning a Western European or American salary, converting effortlessly into a currency that, for now, still buys more square meters than Berlin or Amsterdam. Cost of living data from World Cost of Living puts the average after-tax salary for a Sofia resident at approximately $1,063 a month, with median one-bedroom rent consuming roughly 44% of that, well above the conventional 30% affordability threshold used across this series. That 44% is the number that matters more than any average. It's not what rent costs. It's what rent costs relative to what the person paying it actually earns. The rent figures themselves don't fully agree, and it's worth naming the disagreement rather than picking a winner. Numbeo's April 2026 data puts a one-bedroom apartment in Sofia's city center at approximately €674, with the same unit outside the center at €513. Livingcost.org, sampling a different pool of listings, reports roughly €650 centrally and €500 outside it. Close, but not identical. A third source, aggregating second-hand listings across 3 specific neighborhoods, calculates a citywide one-bedroom average of €765, with a low of €570 in outer residential districts and a high of €1,000 in the city center proper. The spread between the lowest and highest center city estimate is roughly €335 a month, a meaningful gap that likely reflects which listings each source samples, not a factual dispute about Sofia's rental market. Filling out the basic cost of living pillar beyond rent, a 2026 expat focus breakdown puts monthly groceries for a single person at approximately €252 to €350, depending on how much of that basket comes from international chains versus local markets. Utilities for a mid-sized 85 square meter apartment, electricity, heating, water, and garbage collection combined, average €120 to €150 a month across the year, climbing to €150 to €200 in the December to February heating season and dropping to €80 to €110 in summer. High-speed fiber internet adds another €10 to €15 a month. None of these numbers, individually, would stand out anywhere else in this series. Together, they're a large part of why Sofia's overall cost of living index consistently lands below Athens, Lisbon, and most of Western Europe even after the currency switch. Eating out shows the same pattern at street level. A Big Mac costs approximately $3.30 in Sofia, and a Starbucks-style latte runs about $2.30, figures that make even casual dining feel inexpensive by Western European standards. A 5-kilometer Uber ride costs roughly $2.50. One 2026 Digital Nomad budget breakdown estimates approximately $1,171 a month covers co-working space, accommodation, food, and local transport combined for someone working remotely in the city, a figure that would barely cover rent alone in Lisbon or Porto, the two Western European cities this series has already covered. It's worth pausing on one detail from the research process itself, because it illustrates a discipline this series tries to hold consistently: the difference between aggregated data and an angry comment section. Numbio's Sofia page hosts user-submitted remarks describing salad at €15, draft beer at €4, and a claim that Bulgaria now has cost comparable to Frankfurt and Amsterdam following the euro transition. These are individual, unverified price reports from named commenters, not the site's aggregated dataset, and they sit on the same page as Numbio's actual crowdsourced averages, which tell a materially different story. Anecdotes like these are useful as a temperature check on resident sentiment around a currency change. They are not evidence that Sofia's cost structure has actually converged with Frankfurt's, and this script treats them as sentiment, not data. Buying tells an even more tangled story, because at least 4 organizations tracking Sofia in early 2026 report different average transaction prices per square meter, and they don't cluster neatly. Bulgarian properties, cited by Global Property Guide, recorded €2,680 per square meter in Q1 2026, down slightly from €2,790 at the end of 2025, but still 29% above the €2,080 recorded at the start of 2025. A separate Investropo analysis using National Statistical Institute trend data as its anchor cites approximately €2,250 per square meter as the citywide figure. A third market report from early 2026 places the citywide average at €2,300, while noting new build stock specifically trades at €2,500 to €4,000. These are not necessarily contradictory. A government statistical benchmark, a real estate agency's closed transaction average, and a portal's asking price aggregate are 3 different instruments measuring overlapping but distinct slices of the same market. What they agree on is direction, up, sharply, in a single year. Within Sofia, the neighborhood spread is its own ladder. Outer panel block districts like Obelia, Lyulin, and Nadezhda run €1,650 to €2,250 per square meter. Move toward the center and mid-tier areas, and the range lifts to roughly €2,300 to €2,800. Push into Sofia's most sought-after addresses: Oberisht, Ivan Vazov, Luznitz, Iztok, and per square meter prices reach €3,000 to €4,500, with one 2026 report citing a specific Oberisht transaction average of €3,764. For rungs on the same ladder, inside one city. 1,650 euros, 2,300 euros, 3,000 euros, 3,764 euros. A buyer's entire experience of, is Sofia expensive, depends entirely on which rung they're standing on when they ask the question. Translated into what an actual budget buys, one 2026 relocation-focused analysis estimates that $100,000, roughly 86,000 euros at the time of writing, secures a 35 to 40 square meter existing studio in Lyulin or Obelia, or a slightly smaller 30 to 38 square meter unit in Nadezhda. Stretch the budget to a more realistic entry range of 85,000 euros to 130,000 euros, and the same analysis suggests an older studio or small one-bedroom of 35 to 50 square meters becomes available across those same outer districts. At the opposite end, luxury property in Sofia's premium quarters runs 700,000 euros to 1.8 million euros, a range that has little to do with the housing market most residents, local or foreign, actually shop in. For anyone treating Sofia as an investment rather than a home, two figures are worth flagging without embellishment. Mortgage rates in Bulgaria remain among the lowest in the EU, sitting between 2.6% and 4% as of 2026, helped in part by a post-Euro adoption reduction in banks' mandatory reserve requirement from 12% to 1%. A policy change one market report estimated freed up roughly BGN 16 billion, or about 8.2 billion euros, for lending. Rental yields, meanwhile, have compressed from around 6% in 2015 to roughly 4% to 5% in 2026, as home prices have risen faster than the rents landlords can charge for them. Cheap financing and shrinking yields are, in effect, the same story told from two different chairs, the buyers and the landlords. Looking ahead, most 2026 market forecasts expect Sofia's property prices to keep climbing rather than level off. Estimates range from a moderate 5% to 10% nationally to a sharper 8% to 12% specifically for the capital, with one analysis citing 23.49% year-on-year growth already recorded in central Sofia. Whether that pace is sustainable is a question this series doesn't attempt to answer. The pattern worth flagging is that every price cited earlier in this episode is a snapshot from early to mid-2026, not a stable baseline. And a viewer researching Sofia 6 months after this episode airs should expect the real estate figures, in particular, to have moved. And as we'll see when the housing numbers meet the transport and healthcare figures, Sofia's overall affordability case rests less on any single price and more on how consistently every other cost stays low around it. Getting around is where Sofia's post-Euro pricing story turns unusually specific, because the city's transit authority published exact new fares timed to the currency switch rather than letting them drift with inflation. A single 30-minute ticket, valid for transfers between metro, bus, tram, and trolleybus, costs 80 cents. A one-day pass runs 2 euros, with daily spending on contactless card payment automatically capped at 2 euros and 5 cents regardless of how many trips are taken. A monthly pass for all modes costs approximately 25 euros and 50 cents to 26 euros, and an annual pass runs around 185 euros. Bulgarian transit officials stated explicitly that the euro-denominated fares were set to round down rather than up. For instance, a strict mathematical conversion of the monthly pass would have landed at 25 euros and 56 cents, and the published price undercuts even that. Set against other European capitals in this series, a 26 euro monthly pass is difficult to overstate. The same convenience costs roughly 63 euros in Berlin, 95 euros in Amsterdam, and 96 euros in Dublin, meaning a Sofia resident using public transit daily spends, over a year, less than what a Dublin commuter spends in 3 months. The system itself has expanded substantially. For metro lines, 47 stations, and a direct line, the M4, connecting Sofia Airport to the city center in roughly 25 to 30 minutes at metro fares, not airport taxi fares. For context, that airport transfer alone would cost several multiples of 80 cents as a taxi in most Western European capitals. One quality of life detail worth noting alongside the transit figures: Sofia is one of relatively few European capitals with a mountain accessible directly by public transit within city fares. The M2 metro line runs to Vitosha Station, connecting to bus routes that reach hiking trails, the Buena waterfall area, and a gondola lift to the upper slopes for a return ticket of roughly €10 to €15. A standard 80-cent transit ticket covers the buses climbing partway up the mountain. This doesn't offset the salary and rent numbers discussed earlier, but it's a genuine amenity difference that cost of living indices, built around groceries and rent, don't capture, and one that recurring viewers of this series' Balkan and Central European episodes will recognize as a pattern. Lower average costs paired with unusually direct access to nature that most Western capitals would charge a premium for. Now to the part of this episode that didn't exist as recently as December 2025. Bulgaria's Digital Nomad Visa, technically a residence permit under Article 24K of the Foreigners in the Republic of Bulgaria Act, began accepting applications on December 20th, 2025, after amendments passed the National Assembly in June 2025 and implementing regulations were approved that December. It is Bulgaria's first dedicated legal pathway for non-EU remote workers to reside in the country without setting up a local company or navigating a standard work permit process built for the local labor market. The income threshold is where sources diverge, and it's worth naming precisely why. The rule itself is fixed, 50 times Bulgaria's gross minimum monthly wage for the relevant year, but the minimum wage it multiplies keeps changing, so different articles published at different points cite different euro totals for what is mathematically the same formula. One April 2026 legal guide calculates the threshold using the 2025 minimum wage of 1,077 lev, arriving at approximately €27,533. A separate 2026 guide applies the updated 2026 minimum wage of 1,213 lev to the same 50 times formula and reaches BGN 53,850, or roughly €27,540. Nearly identical despite the different inputs, because both start from a similar base. Most current sources, however, round the practical requirement to approximately €31,000 per year, which appears to reflect the most recently adjusted minimum wage figure feeding the same calculation. The takeaway isn't which number is correct, it's that the threshold is explicitly indexed to Bulgarian wage growth, meaning it will keep climbing on a fixed schedule that has nothing to do with a nomad's own income. The application process runs in two stages. A foreign national first applies for a Type D long-stay visa at a Bulgarian embassy or consulate, at a base fee of roughly €100. After arrival, they have 14 days to apply for the residence permit itself at Bulgaria's Migration Directorate, which carries an additional fee of approximately 500 lev, or roughly €256, for the first year. The permit is valid for 1 year and renewable once, for a maximum combined stay of 2 years, after which, notably, time spent under this specific status does not count toward Bulgaria's long-term or permanent residence requirements. It is designed as a temporary bridge, not a path to settlement. Eligibility splits into 3 categories: remote employees under contract with a company registered outside the EU, EEA, or Switzerland, owners or partners holding more than 25% of such a foreign company, and independent freelancers with at least 1 year of documented professional experience in their field. Every applicant must also show medical insurance with a minimum coverage of €30,000 valid in Bulgaria or the wider EU, along with a police clearance certificate from their country of citizenship or habitual residence, translated and legalized. None of this applies, worth repeating clearly, to EU, EEA, or Swiss citizens, who can simply register for a long-term EU residence certificate at the Migration Directorate without touching any of the digital nomad framework at all. The entire apparatus described here exists for one specific population, non-EU remote workers, and only those clearing the income bar. For the substantial share of this audience holding an EU, EEA, or Swiss passport, almost everything described in the last several paragraphs simply doesn't apply. Free movement rules let an EU citizen relocate to Sofia, register a permanent address, and apply for a long-term EU residence certificate at the Migration Directorate without a visa, an income threshold, or a residence permit fee beyond routine administrative costs. The entire digital nomad apparatus, the €31,000 income bar, the Type D visa, the 2-year cap, the medical insurance minimum, exists specifically because that free movement door isn't open to non-EU citizens. It's a useful reminder that moving to Sofia is not one process. It's at least two entirely different bureaucratic realities depending on the passport in the mover's pocket. One number does work in the remote worker's favor beyond the exchange rate. Bulgaria's flat 10% personal income tax, among the lowest in the European Union. For a freelancer operating under the Digital Nomad Permit, that compares to a progressive structure reaching 19% corporate tax in Warsaw, a combined roughly 16% corporate plus 5% dividend tax in Romania, and marginal personal rates as high as 43% in Italy or 45% in the UK. Employees still face Bulgaria's roughly 13 to 14% social security contribution on top of income tax, handled by the employer and deducted before the net salary figures already cited in this episode. But for the specific population targeted by the Digital Nomad Permit, freelancers and foreign company owners, the 10% flat rate is a genuine structural advantage layered on top of already lower living costs. One older, unrelated route deserves a brief mention because it surfaces regularly in relocation forums. Purchasing real estate in Bulgaria valued at a minimum of €305,900 can qualify a buyer for a temporary residence permit through a separate investment-based process. It's a slower, more document-heavy path than the Digital Nomad Permit, and not one this series treats as a practical option for most remote workers, but it exists, and it's a different door into the same country. Healthcare in Sofia runs on a dual-track system that every resident, local or foreign, eventually has to understand. The National Health Insurance Fund, NHIF, or NZUK in Bulgarian, is the mandatory public scheme funded by an 8% contribution on gross salary. For employees, the employer covers 4.8 percentage points and the employee covers 3.2. Self-employed residents and freelancers pay the full 8% themselves. That 8% rate has been explicitly maintained in the 2026 NHIF budget, meaning it isn't in flux the way some of Sofia's other numbers are this year. What NHIF actually buys is broader than its reputation suggests. Outpatient consultations with a registered general practitioner, specialist referrals, hospitalization at contracted facilities, preventive care, and designated prescription medicines. A GP visit under NHIF carries a small copayment, cited at approximately €1.50 or 2.90 lev. And inpatient hospital care is free for active contributors, with emergency services free for everyone regardless of insurance status. What it does not cover, for most adults, is dental care beyond very limited exceptions, and it does not cover routine vision care or glasses at all. This is where the private layer comes in, and where the Sofia healthcare story stops being about affordability and starts being about speed and language. A private GP visit typically runs €30 to €60, with specialist consultations at €50 to €100. Most expats layer a mid-tier private plan from domestic insurers like DZI, Bulstrad, Generali, or Allianz, on top of mandatory NHIF contributions, at a combined estimated cost of roughly €830 to €1,030 a year for a setup that includes public coverage, private specialist access, and English-speaking doctors. Younger applicants in the 25 to 35 bracket can find basic standalone private plans from as little as €200 a year. Comprehensive plans adding dental, optical, and international coverage run €800 to €1,200 annually. Full international insurance, the kind aimed at frequent cross-border travelers rather than Bulgaria-based residents, costs substantially more, at €150 to €500 or higher per month, and most guides describe it as unnecessary overkill for someone actually settled in Sofia. Two private hospital names come up repeatedly in this research: Takuta Hospital and Asabatum City Clinic, both concentrated, like the entire private care sector, in Sofia itself. That concentration carries a geographic caveat worth stating plainly. Healthcare quality outside the capital, particularly in smaller towns and mountain regions, is considerably more limited, with residents in those areas often traveling to Sofia for anything beyond basic or emergency care. Choosing to live outside the capital, whether in Bansko's ski country or a Black Sea coastal town, means implicitly choosing a lower healthcare ceiling than the one this episode describes. Daily life logistics carry one soft cost that doesn't show up in any of the figures above: language. English is widely spoken in Sofia's private clinics, co-working spaces, and expat-facing services, but interactions with government offices, banks, and utility companies frequently still require Bulgarian, or at minimum a local intermediary. Several relocation guides consulted for this episode recommend budgeting for a local lawyer or consultant during the first several months. Not because the bureaucracy is unusually hostile, but because forms, notices, and in-person appointments default to Bulgarian in a way that Western European capitals with larger long-term expat populations have often adapted around. It's a cost measured in time and friction rather than euros, but it belongs in the same ledger as rent and transit passes. Put the 5 pillars next to each other, and as we'll see, the pattern isn't that any single cost in Sofia is remarkable. It's that almost none of them are, except one. One side of this story, a Bulgarian resident earning Sofia's average salary of roughly €1,783 to €1,914 a month, contributing 3.2% of it to NHIF automatically, budgeting €26 for a full month of unlimited transit, and watching close to half of a more modest paycheck disappear into rent the moment they're not earning at the city average. For this person, Sofia's affordability is real but conditional, genuine relative to Western Europe, tight relative to their own income, and now further complicated by watching prices convert from lev to euro in a way that, rightly or not, many residents describe as feeling like inflation even where the underlying math is a flat currency peg. The other side, a non-EU remote worker clearing the roughly €31,000 annual income bar, paying a Type D visa fee and a residence permit fee that together run under €400, arriving to a rental market where €674 secures a central one-bedroom, and layering €30 to 80 month private insurance onto an NHIF system they can access as soon as they're contributing. For this person, the arithmetic that feels tight to a Sofia local looks close to effortless, not because prices are different, but because the income funding them was never priced in levs to begin with. It's worth being precise about who actually experiences the euro transition as a cost increase and who doesn't. For a Sofia resident paid in local currency, salary converts at the same fixed 1.95583 rate as prices do. In theory, a neutral, one-time relabeling with no real change in purchasing power. In practice, multiple 2026 sources describe merchants rounding prices upward during the transition more often than downward, meaning the lived experience for many residents involves modest but real inflation layered on top of a currency change that was designed to be invisible. A remote worker earning and often still banking in euros or dollars never touches that rounding effect at all. For them, the peg simply confirms a number they were already calculating in their head: 1.95583 lev to the euro. For 29 years, that number sat quietly in the background of Bulgaria's economy, a technical peg most residents never thought about. It's now the exact rate stamped onto every converted salary, every repriced rent listing, every menu in Sofia that used to be denominated in a currency that no longer exists. The number didn't create Sofia's affordability. Decades of comparatively low wages and a currency board did that. But it's the number standing at the exact seam between the Sofia that was cheap because of what it paid its own people, and the Sofia now being priced, discussed, and marketed in the currency of the people arriving to spend somewhere else's income. Is Sofia still the cheapest capital in the EU? Or just the newest one still catching up to what that used to mean? And for the resident earning the city's own average salary, is the gap between €1,914 and what a two-bedroom apartment now costs closing, or quietly getting wider under a currency that's supposed to make prices easier to compare?